Welcome to History and Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today, my dear friends and subscribers and visitors to my channel, I'd like to answer one question. What can the coalition of the willing do for Ukraine? The reason I'm asking this question is that 2 days ago, on the 24th of August, the coalition of the willing had one more session in Kiev on the occasion of the Day of Independence. I can't resist by just commenting a couple of words on the Day of Independence, which was proclaimed in August 1991. And then there was a referendum in December, and then there was, prior to that, a couple of weeks, there was a meeting of the Communist Party chiefs of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and they jointly announced that they walk out of the Soviet Union. And this happened in the same year that earlier in that year, all these republics, including Russia and Belarus and Ukraine, were among those who voted in a referendum staged by Mr. Gorbachev to preserve the Soviet Union. And the citizens of Ukraine voted in their majority to preserve the Soviet Union. And then, just about half a year later, the Communist Party chiefs assembled and decided to uh, quit the Soviet Union. What they're actually trying to do was to undermine the power of Gorbachev. But this is a separate story, and if you're interested, you could read about it in my book, From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin, which will be on your screen later in the program. In any case, what's also important about this Declaration of Independence is that it led to the Ukrainian constitution, which actually was based on the neutral status for Ukraine in the constitution, open borders with Russia, and freedom of movement of people between Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, kind of modeled on the European Union. That is the kind of independent Ukraine that was supposed to be. And it lasted until 2014, when there was a coup d'etat, and the people who came to power wrote in the constitution their desire to join NATO. And then what some people call the Project Ukraine began, which was a project against Russia. In any case, we fast forward to these celebrations, and there were this coalition of the willing that came to Kiev. Now, my question today will be, what exactly did they promise, and who exactly is willing, and who is willing to do what, and what is said unsaid, which means unwilling. So, the most spectacular breakthrough, which was picked up by all the Western media, was that the British and the French promised to Ukraine what Ukraine needs most, and that is missiles. And the British Prime Minister brought the blueprints of Storm Shadow in a theatrical manner. He gave it to Zelensky as if they were going to be produced in Ukraine. Similarly, President Macron has said that the deliveries of French interceptor missiles would be speeded up, and this is called Aster 30 interceptors plus Scalp version of Storm Shadow will be delivered to Ukraine. But there was no specifics. There were no numbers, and that there were no commitments as to specific dates. So in many ways, this was a gesture to support Zelensky and the Ukraine, and these are somewhat different. I'll come back to it on the occasion of the Independence Day. Now, before I go any further, let me comment on these transfers, because this is just a theatrical move. Because Foreign Minister Lavrov commented on this by saying that this act, in terms of international law, uh, means that Britain and France have declared themselves to be party to the war, because by international law, open delivery of weapons system and joint production of those is qualified as participation in the war. So that's not Lavrov's interpretation. This is a matter of fact. And Lavrov mentioned, and Peskov repeated yesterday, that means that Russia reserves for itself the right to act accordingly. So, in one way, we could say that this coalition of the willing step of what they thought effective public relations campaign of blueprints and deliveries of missiles may in fact lead at a later date to Russian hits on those facilities. Now, obviously, if they are produced in Ukraine, the Russian intelligence is going to find out and they're going to blow them up, even if they are deep underground. But let's move on. The next thing that the coalition of the willing um, promised is actually a repetition of what EU promised, and that is $26 billion or euros by the end of the year, a part of the package of 90 billion that was voted earlier. However, so far up to now, there's only 6 billion that have been delivered. And the important thing here is that even if these 26 billion will be delivered, which is in question, and the reason that is in question is because in order for them to be delivered, they have to be approved. And the reason that they could be approved is if Ukraine is winning, or is at least has a chance to survive, to use the money. And that is, my dear friends, why the Western media launched a propaganda campaign uh, announcing everywhere that the Ukraine is winning, that Russia is suffering, Russia is losing, Ukraine is advancing, and on and on. And of course, I join the chorus of those who are saying this is just a show. Yes, Ukraine has hit successfully Russian oil installations and Russian um, civilian infrastructure, and it killed a 3-year-old boy yesterday in a hit on Krasnodar. But all of that will not and cannot change the course of the war. Because if we compare apples to apples and pears to pears, and if we compare what the Russians have hit in the last 2 weeks, then the comparison would be quite appalling for the future of Ukraine. Because if things go the way they do, Ukraine simply will not have any industry left by the end of the year. These are absolutely devastating hits, and very, very careful, sparing human life and civilians. Obviously, unfortunately, some of them do die, but at the rate of 3, 4, 5 after 700, 800 missiles hit facilities in Ukraine, Kiev, Odessa, and other places. So this is about the propaganda offensive, what I call as if reality. The reason that von der Leyen and others keep repeating that Ukraine is winning is because the loan of 90 billion is supposed to be backed up by future Russian reparations. Russia is supposed to lose the war and pay reparations. But then, if it dawns on the Europeans that Russia will not lose and will not pay reparations, then the 90 billion will have to be backed up by the European taxpayers. This is why the von der Leyen and others cannot openly admit that Ukraine is losing, because if it is losing, then nobody is willing to pay the money, and then there wouldn't be any coming. So they have to create the fiction and support the fiction that Ukraine is winning, and they do it by supporting Ukrainian hits on the Amazon equivalent, wild berries or ozone or other commercial storage facilities that have nothing to do with the military. Now, also, judging by what Mr. Putin has said in the last few days, Russia has been working and is effectively building anti drone defense measures that, in some places, such as Moscow region, have shown that out of hundreds of drones, one or two, or by official statistics, 98% are shot down. So this is as far as the Ukrainian successes and the money promised. Now, I doubt very much that they would be able to deliver 26 billion, and this is why Zelensky is giving speeches about a hole in the budget and his desperate need for money. And this is what he's been doing over the last several years: is going around raising money. That caused the joke of Trump about him being effective money raiser. Now, let me now focus on the coalition of the willing. Now, it's very interesting to actually make a list who is willing and the relationship between those who consider themselves willing and that of NATO. Now, what's interesting here, of course, is the legal side. Now, as we all know, NATO has an Article 5 which says that if there is an attack on one member state, the others are supposed to help through consultations and presumably come to its aid. However, what happens if a group of NATO countries forms a coalition of the willing, which is not a separate organization? It's just kind of informal club of those who show up and who don't. And of those who showed up, there were actually quite very few. And Merz and Macron joined it by telephone, by video, Zoom call, or whatever. So, if one of the members of the coalition of the willing provides missiles to Ukraine, and international law says that that provision of missiles is qualifying that part of the NATO, that part of the coalition, as a party to war. And if Russia destroys those missiles in UK, what does that mean? Does that oblige other members of NATO to come to its defense and declare war on Russia? I doubt it very much. Moreover, I assert that that does not mean at all, because these countries were not consulted. They were not a part of the decision to provide missiles to Ukraine. The decision belongs to a country, in this case UK and France. Therefore, for example, Greece or Spain or Italy, would they be required to go to war with Russia if Russia destroys a Storm Shadow plant in Britain? I doubt it very much. Moreover, the coalition of the willing implies that there is a coalition of the unwilling. In other words, those who did not join the coalition of the willing, in fact, are counted as those that are not willing because they didn't show up and they don't want to join. And if we look at the posture of such countries as Greece, Cyprus, Croatia, Montenegro, Italy, Malta, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, that's 12. None of them are willing. And this is already a third of NATO. And I doubt very much that if you ask the French public, or if there is an actual consultations to join the war against Russia, I doubt very much that the French public would support it. In fact, I think they will not. And that would be shown in next year's elections, where both opposition parties to Macron want to establish publicly on record of saying good relations with Russia. In other words, to me, the coalition of the willing is more of an indication that it is not NATO, and that more than a third of NATO members are on record of not being in the coalition of the willing. So that's as far as the money goes and as far as the willingness of countries to join. Now, let me address the third promise that was made in Kiev, and that is that Russia should accept unconditional ceasefire and that after this unconditional ceasefire is accepted, they will be forming out of the willing some kind of a peacekeeping force that they would send to Ukraine. That is absolutely preposterous, daydreaming or whatever you want to call it, but has nothing to do reality. Why? Because Russia is not going to accept any unconditional ceasefire. It has announced it many, many times. In order to force Russia to conclude unconditional ceasefire, one would have to defeat Russia first. And that is impossible simply because Russia has the largest supply of intercontinental missiles and drones and what have you, hypersonic missiles that hit Ukraine by the hundreds every single day. And therefore, daydreaming of forcing Russia to do anything is no more than daydreaming. Therefore, why do they say this then? Why do they keep repeating that they would send some kind of coalition of the willing occupation force or peacekeepers? I think this is just to feel good. This is the kind of to make themselves sound as if they matter something and as if they mean something and as if they have the strength to do it. That is absolutely impossible. Moreover, if they really cared about the fate of Ukraine, as they claim they do, the smartest thing would have been to accept Putin's demands now and conclude peace and save whatever is to be saved of Ukraine. But by persisting and encouraging Ukraine to fight and by promising military aid and storm shadows and whatnot, they are simply extending the agony of Zelensky's regime, and that would mean, in the end, a more painful terms that they would have to accept when it all ends. Now, a lot of people asking this fundamental question: when will it end? If Russia is so strong, the argument goes, why has not it yet delivered a crushing blow? My answer is very, very simple. Up until July 2026, Russia still pursued the goals of the special military operation that were announced by President Putin in 2024, which meant 4 provinces plus Crimea plus neutrality plus no membership in NATO plus no foreign troops. This is no longer the case. After the encouraging by the European Union strikes into Russian civilian and oil infrastructure, this year, 2026, will be remembered in history as the year of the change of Russian war aims. Now, Russian war aim is total victory over the Zelensky criminal regime. That's not my wording. This is the official Russian wording. In other words, there's no negotiations, no agreements, no compromises, no spirit of anchorage. It is now going to be victory. When? We shall see. But the way things are going, Ukraine will not have much of its industry or military infrastructure left by the end of the fall 2026. And then we shall see how and when it will unravel. Thank you very much. And I end on this today, my dear friends, and I want to encourage to read my book, subscribe to my channel, check if you like to read my Substack on the screen, and listen to my audios in Spotify and other platforms. Goodbye.